Westphalia. In the spring of 1945, city by city, village by village, American and British troops occupy the region between the Ruhr and the Weser. On the 23rd and 24th March, British and American troops cross the Rhine near Wesel. The offensive is accompanied by massive aerial bombardments. In the last weeks of the war, many Westphalian cities that had been spared so far felt the full force of the war. The German defense system, which was pompously dubbed the Westphalian Wall, proved to be completely ineffective against the personnel and material highly superior Allies. While British troops from Wesel overrun the western Münsterland and take Münster together with American units in the Easter days, the 9th US Army rushes south of Münster to the east. On the 1st in April, she met units of the 1st US Army near Lippstadt, which had marched to the northeast from the Remagen bridgehead through this pincer closure. Around 320,000 German soldiers trapped in the so-called Ruhr Kessel. In just 3 weeks, the US troops under the command of General Eisenhower conquer the industrial heart of Germany by April 21st. The American units are accompanied by camera teams from the US Signal Corps. Embedded in the advancing troops, they capture the occupation of the region on film in some spectacular images. Writing boards reveal the names and units of the US cameramen, all shot in black and white film for various purposes. In addition to tactical war planning, training and moral rearmament of the troops, they are also used in cinema newsreels. In this way, the local population in the USA is informed about the progress of the war, and the recordings are re-edited, subsequently set to sound and commented. Last but not least, the material is intended to document the crimes of the National Socialist regime.
Viele Dinge sind nicht, wie sie scheinen, und bloße Tatsachen sind oft verbogen.
These sequences from a forced labor camp near Stukenbrock later find their way into the Nuremberg war crimes trials. Today, all the footage that the Americans shot during the Second World War are stored in Washington, D.C. Around 8 hours of footage have been viewed and critically analyzed for this documentary. The most meaningful scenes have been selected, set to music, and provided with a commentary. The recordings show the history of the end of the war in Westphalia from the perspective of the Americans. Although many scenes are recognizably staged, today they form unique documents of contemporary history, on the one hand because they are mostly the only moving images of the end of the war in the cities and villages of Westphalia. On the other hand, because they cast an outside view of the end and new beginning of 1945 and bring into the picture aspects that do not appear in contemporary German reports. Last but not least, the footage illustrates how the American troops saw themselves and how they want to be seen at home by the Germans and posterity. When the Allied troops reached Westphalia at the end of March 1945, the war had long since arrived in the region. British units have been bombing German cities since 1939, and bomb warfare has changed dramatically since then. Initially, only military targets, transport hubs, and objects of the defense industry will be attacked. By the end of 1941, these attacks had little success. The Allied aircraft and attack fleets were too small. The bombs rarely hit their targets. In February 1942, the British Air Ministry issued the directive for surface bombing. Under the new head of Bomber Command, Arthur Harris, the moral bombing thus begins. The destruction of residential areas is no longer just accepted as collateral damage, but consciously included in the planning. At the beginning of 1943. Are the Americans intervening in the European theater of war with strong bomber formations? At the Casablanca Conference, the combined bomber offensive is decided. The British are to carry out area bombings on German cities at night in order to demoralize the civilian population. The Americans attack key targets of the German armaments industry during the day. The Ruhr area will become the primary target of attack, explains the city of Hamm. The new strategy will soon be felt. The city, with its important freight yard, had already been bombed more than 100 times by then, but mostly only by small units as part of the First Battle of the Ruhr. Has Hamm been attacked by strong US bomber fleets since March 1943? The most serious attack on the city can be seen here. It took place on the 22nd, Isun X references XX. In April 1945, the almost completely destroyed city was occupied by US troops. On the same day, US cameramen record the destruction in the station area. Despite all the damage, it is noticeable that large areas of the station remain intact. This phenomenon is also evident in other cities. After the invasion, US soldiers film in a steelworks of high-frequency Tiegelstahl in Bochum, where gun barrels and shell casings were produced. Knocked out steelworks, the cameraman announces, and in fact no stone seems to rest on top of another. On closer inspection, however, you can see garnet casings on production lines, carefully stacked casings, intact machines. It was recently worked on, and this was despite the fact that the city of Bochum and its industrial facilities had been bombed regularly between 1943 and 1944. However, in many cases, the bombs only destroyed the buildings, not the machines, so that production often restarted after a short time. Münster was also bombed many times during the war. The most devastating attack, which will go down in the city's history as a Black Day, took place on the 10th, October 1943. On this sunny autumn day, the city is full of people when full alert is given at 2:50 p.m. Only 10 minutes later, 236 B-17 bombers attacked the city with almost 29,000 explosive and incendiary bombs. After about 15 minutes, the city center is almost completely destroyed. Over 700 people lose their lives. 1 week later, on Easter Monday, the almost completely destroyed capital of Westphalia is captured by British and American troops. In the course of the Allied advance, cities that had so far been spared from the bombing war are also targeted. Paderborn, for example, experienced its first heavy attack in January 1945. In March 1945, more bombings followed. People lost their lives. The city center was almost completely destroyed. The bombers no longer had to count on resistance at this time. Neither a German fighter plane nor anti-aircraft fire can be seen. By the end of the war, British and American bomber groups will have destroyed almost all major cities in Westphalia. The rapid advance on German soil presents the Allies with great logistical challenges. Mastering them is a feat of mastery. Endless queues of trucks with material, fields full of petrol cans, armies of specialists busy with nothing but keeping supplies running. The strategy of U.S. General George Patton pays off. His requirement before the crossing over the Rhine, the supply on the other side must be ensured. Now the U.S. troops are fighting their way deeper into Reich territory day by day, while their supply is reliably guaranteed. Despite the concern about Nazi partisans, the notorious werewolf, no intensive security measures can be seen. The Reich Autobahnen are effectively used by American logistics. Originally designed for the German war of aggression, the Allied troops are now advancing towards Berlin. Even in the air, supplies are crowded. Hundreds of planes deliver tons of supplies every day at improvised airfields, especially fuel, ammunition, and food. The resources seem inexhaustible. This is exactly what the pictures should testify to. The material superiority of the Americans is overwhelming. The food is also secured. Here in Bad Salzuflen, American soldiers line up for their food. The meals seem rich and balanced. As if to illustrate this, a pineapple slice falls down. It is left demonstratively and extensively filmed to stop the advance of the U.S. Army. The German defenders blow up bridges after crossing the Rhine, but such obstacles do not represent a real challenge either in military or technical terms. If the bridge piers are still intact, the bridges will be replaced at short notice with the help of component constructions. The specialists of the pioneer battalions are entrusted not only with the construction, but also with the maintenance of these temporary bridges. Because of the vibrations caused by the vehicles, all connections between the individual elements must be continuously checked and retightened. Another method of river crossing are pontoon bridges, floating bridges without a solid foundation, which are composed of individual containers connected by runners. On the 8th of April, the American pioneers of the 9th U.S. Army propose such pontoon bridges here, cross the Weser, and put on the eastern side of the river. About these floating bridges are not a modern invention, but known since antiquity. What is new, however, is that such large quantities of military material are transported via them. Like here, not far from Lügde, pontoon bridges are being built over the Weser in many places. This ensures the Americans a broad advance corridor. This is possible because the Allied troops have long had air sovereignty. The German Luftwaffe is more or less destroyed is a special feature of modern pontoon bridges. That they allow all military vehicles with different track widths and weight classes to cross. Even for tanks, translating is no problem. 1 month after these recordings, the German Reich will be crushed by the military power of the Allies, surrendering unconditionally. Only 8 days after crossing the Rhine, the Americans closed the Ruhr Basin at Lippstadt. They initially bypassed the Sauerland, now they are advancing into the mountainous region. Due to the impassable terrain, the Americans have to painstakingly conquer village by village. In numerous locations, associations from the SS, Wehrmacht, and Volkssturm put up fierce resistance, compelling American soldiers to conquer street by street and house by house, because tanks and artillery fire cannot always break German resistance. The US Air Force must provide support. On the 7th, in April 1945, the battle for Schmallenberg began with an air raid. The German troops have gathered heavy military equipment here and are offering fierce resistance. Only with air support and tank fire did the Americans gain access to Schmallenberg. The troops enter the city cautiously, always on the lookout for German resistance. At the end of the day, the German defenders lost the long battle for Schmallenberg. The old town is almost completely destroyed. The half-timbered houses were not able to withstand the fire and explosive bombs of the US Air Force and often burned down to the foundations. The invasion of Würdinghausen begins on August 8th, April, at first peacefully and without incident. The village had been shelled with artillery the night before, but every house was searched for soldiers and weapons, and on the further advance towards Saalhausen there were repeated fights along the railway line. This should absolutely be conquered in order to prevent German supplies. Due to the fierce resistance, the advance can only be continued the following day. Towards evening, the Americans succeed in small battles, the last houses along the railway embankment, as well as a position with anti-aircraft guns to occupy. The war ended in Elspe on the 11th. The village had been bombarded with artillery until the early morning of April. One witness remembers.
After the artillery fire in the past few days, I was curious to see what the village of Elspe looked like now. At the labor camp stood a destroyed German flag gun. The first residents were in the process of vacating their apartments. There were knocks everywhere in the street, in the gardens, meadows, and houses.
The cities of the northern Ruhr area are directly affected by the rapid advance of the Allies. The troops advancing to the east usually conquer only a few districts of the city. The front line stretches through the middle of the cities for days, until the Americans then gradually smash the enclosed cauldron and completely capture the cities. Already one day after crossing the Rhine, soldiers of the 9th were standing. US Army at the gates of the city of Gelsenkirchen. They are involved in fierce fighting, to which they respond with heavy artillery fire and hunting bomb attacks. On March 31st, the US troops stopped their advance on the Rhine-Herne Canal, which runs through the middle of the city. All the bridges over the canal and the Emscher were blown up by the retreating German soldiers a few hours before. Only a week later, on the night of the 6th in April, US troops crossed the channel in several places without special resistance. In the next few days, they will continue to advance. On the 9th, in April, the first US soldiers marched into the Bismarck district and the Old Town. Until the 11th April, the entire city is occupied. The war for the population is over. In the end, there are thousands of dead on Gelsenkirchen's balance sheet. More than 50% of the living space is completely destroyed. More than 40% seriously damaged. Much of this damage was not caused by the Allied advance, but by the previous bombing campaign. On the way to the encirclement of the Ruhr area, Hamm is also initially bypassed and only touched by the front on the northern outskirts of the city. The city is already heavily destroyed by the years of bombing. However, due to its large moving yard, it continues to have a strategic importance for the German defenders. After the US troops on the 31st, having reached the northern outskirts of the city in March, they try to take the entire city the next day, but here too they encounter resistance. As they advance towards the train station, the US soldiers are involved in a house fight. Although it succeeds on the second, Ulysses references, Ulysses equals external links, Ulysses, official website, April. The latest attacks increase the damage in the cityscape once again. Hamm is one of the most destroyed cities in the Ruhr area. The southern cities of the Westphalian Ruhr area will be taken in the next few days. Bochum on April 10th, Dortmund on April 13th, and Hagen on April 15th. A few days later, the last cities in the district are occupied. The Ruhr Kessel is smashed. In their rapid advance, the Allies encounter German defenders who are inferior to them in every way. In the Volkssturm, Hitler mobilized his last reserves, a pitifully equipped militia army of old, frail men and old children. Many older people in particular just want to go home after more than 5 years of war. Anyone who deserts will be shot without trial. In the end, even 15-year-olds are sent to war. The young people with no combat experience pay for their senseless commitment all too often with their lives. Who survives like these boys captured by the Americans at Herford? Is marked by the horrors of war. The advancing Americans even encounter uniformed women. They have been thrown into the fight for final victory as Air Force assistants. A highly critical moment is always the moment of capture. Like here in Hamm, people shot at each other minutes before. All of a sudden, the guns are silent. Here in Würdinghausen in Sauerland, things go smoothly, but sometimes it ends fatally because the Allied soldiers assess the situation incorrectly or feelings of revenge override elementary rules of martial law. Rumors of guerrilla actions exacerbate the situation. Civilians can also be in great danger if, for example, they wear a suspicious uniform like these Reichsbahnen in Old Dogs. Some contemporary witnesses report a harsh, sometimes brutal action against the captured soldiers. Almost nothing of this can be seen in the US filming, not even here in Herne. Beatings, third parties and harsher abuse occur, but are not the rule. Here in Waldstede, in the district of Warendorf, German officers are thoroughly searched. Officially, the Americans are looking for weapons and incriminating documents, but watches, rings, medals and other valuables are also popular souvenirs. Scissors and knives are collected in Langenberg near Gütersloh. At least one goes into the pocket of a US soldier. With the conquest of the Ruhr Basin in mid-April 1945, more than 320,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner in one fell swoop. A huge army of beaten, weakened, worn down, or simply relieved. A US lieutenant writes on the 15th April in his diary.
German soldiers were pouring in from everywhere, wanting to surrender in such numbers that it is impossible to count them. They came in every type of vehicle of the German army. They deliver everything intact, from pistols to 24-centimeter howitzers, with the enthusiasm of children on Christmas. GIs drove around in German trucks in all directions. It was a great picture. The Germans were so happy about the opportunity to surrender without further bloodshed that some of them actually waved to the invading enemy. They're a beaten bunch and very willing to call it quits, if you can get out of it alive.
The Americans initially gathered the prisoners of war in temporary camps on the edge of the Ruhr Basin. A US reporter reports from one of these camps.
The picture of the prisoners is kaleidoscopic. There are young lads, old men, arrogant SS people, Red Cross sisters, Hitler boys and Prussian guys, formally correct with monocles, more than enough to make the heart of a Hollywood film director beat faster.
For most, they then continue by truck to the notorious Rhine Meadow camps. But for some of the youngest soldiers, the war ends immediately as they are sent home by the Americans with the pants legs of their uniforms cut off, dressed in shorts. In the war's final weeks, exhaustion and fear of an uncertain future dominate the everyday lives of millions of German civilians, who almost all hope for a swift conclusion. The bombing of cities and the deaths of many thousands.